I want to welcome you to the Lundquist College of Business, the Lillis Business Complex, for the first of several engaging China lectures that we're very excited to be launching this year. I'm Paul Swangard. I'm the Managing Director of the Warsaw Sports Marketing Center here in the College of Business, and on behalf of the Center for Asian and Pacific Studies and also the Office of the President, our chief sponsors of this event, we certainly appreciate you guys taking the time out of your day and hopefully continue to take times out of your Fridays throughout the spring for what we think will be some really interesting talks on a variety of topics related to China. One of the reasons that the College of Business got involved was really trying to extend our arms across the university community to find ways that our business students could really benefit from the breadth and depth of knowledge that's available on this campus, and China seemed like a pretty good place to start. As part of the China summits that many of you who are here probably were involved on as well, when we began to gather information and as a campus community, it really was, we were all struck by just how much expertise exists on this campus. As it relates to my little part of the world, the sports marketing program, 20 of the folks sitting in this room are representative of our MBA program in sports business. With the Beijing Olympics coming up in 2008, the Olympic trials here in Eugene, just seems like it's a place and a part of the world that we need to focus our attentions on as sports marketers. In that context, just a couple of numbers to throw out to you. When an NBA basketball game is televised in the United States, roughly 1 million viewers are watching on 3 to 4 national television networks. In China, in a different time zone, watching live, 30 million people are typically watching an average NBA game. 1/2 of all internet traffic to NBA.com comes through China on its China language site. And even participatory sports like golf. There were really no golf courses to speak of 20 years ago in China. Now there are over 200 with 5 million people calling themselves active golfers. So the market from a business perspective is certainly something to be recognized and studied. And yet I think in all of this we need to understand the cultural context of the country. I was in Beijing with Dennis Howard last year, and the story we like to relay is the trip we took to the Forbidden City. And you get to the midst of the Forbidden City, which is a beautiful traditional Chinese architecture, and you get to the middle of the Forbidden City and there's a Starbucks in the middle of the Forbidden City. And while the Americano was refreshing, actually, because we were all cold by that time, it struck us as being maybe not the right thing to be seeing in the middle of the Forbidden City. So with that, I think the benefit here for our business students is that cultural context, which we hope they take to heart as they learn to be the business students in the future. Our first speech for the session is Steve Durant, and just a few notes on him before his laptop goes to sleep. He is the professor of Chinese literature at the Department of East Asian Language and Literature in the College of Arts and Sciences, a Bachelor of Arts from BYU, which we don't hold him against for that. The PhD from Washington, I do hold against you, unfortunately. Has served as the head of the Department of East Asian Language and Literature during his tenure here, also has served as the Associate Dean for the College of Arts and Sciences, has been recognized on this campus as one of the outstanding faculty, received the Thomas Herman Achievement Award back in 2001, and also addressed our graduates as commencement speaker in 2003, and I'm told a great way to start our Engaging China series. So without further ado, please turn the floor over to Stephen Durant.
First of all, thank you for your kind introduction, and thank you to all of you for coming today. You'll see that I've added a subtitle, Thank Goodness, and the thank goodness is there because I need students. Before I begin the formal part of my presentation today, I'd like to give you an idea of the period of time I will be speaking about. What I'm referring to here is ancient China. Here's a timeline, and I want to emphasize now, and I will repeat this again later on, that any date before 841 BCE is not exact, it's conjectural. Okay, so according to this traditional timeline, which I will challenge in some ways later on, you have the great founder of the Chinese state, the Yellow Emperor, Huangdi. who presumably lived sometime around 2500 BCE. He is one of 5 emperors who rule in what we might refer to as a pre-dynastic period. This is a legendary period, a mythic period, as I will say later on. Following the 5 emperors, you have the 3 dynasties, the Xia, the Shang, sometimes called the Yin, and the Zhou dynasty. Again, I will say more about these periods later. The Eastern Zhou is particularly interesting because this is a period of time when the Zhou polity, the Zhou state, falls apart, and you have a long period of disunity called the Spring and Autumn period, and then followed by a period of time called the Warring States period. And this is a particularly important time in Chinese history. It's a period when Chinese literature flowers and Chinese philosophy, might say, blooms. So it's an extremely interesting period of time. The disunity of the Spring and Autumn and the Warring States period comes to an end with the unification of China under the Qin in 221 BCE, and that dynasty is followed by the Han, or the Western Han, really. And this is the period of time I'm going to be talking about today. So with that as a kind of just sort of setting the temporal scene, let me begin. Item 1. In 1973, Mao Zedong unleashed a mass campaign entitled Picong Yangqin, Criticize Confucius and Praise the Qin. The campaign was directed against Lin Biao and others improbably labeled as reactionaries, and thus identified with that greatest of all reactionaries, Confucius. What I find particularly interesting in this movement is that it focused attention upon a man, Confucius, who had been dead for approximately 2,500 years, and upon a dynasty, the Qin, that had fallen approximately 2,000 years earlier. Hundreds of articles soon appeared in the popular press and in scholarly journals attacking the long-dead Confucius and praising the wise policies of the long-fallen Qin dynasty. Were our president to launch a comparable campaign today, perhaps praise Alexander the Great and criticize Socrates, I think that we would all consider it either a joke or proof that he has gone mad. What, in Mao Zedong's view, made the Qin dynasty, 221 to 207 BCE, so praiseworthy? One of the primary policies of the main emperor of this dynasty, the first Qin emperor, Qin Shi Huangdi, had been inspired by a minister by the name of Li Si, who submitted a very important memorial in 213 BCE. The memorial said in part, and I quote, "The 5 emperors did not imitate each other. The 3 dynasties did not carry on each other's ways, yet each was well governed. But nowadays, scholars, instead of looking to the present, study antiquity in order to criticize their own age, misleading and confusing the common people." Li Si went on to make a suggestion. "I therefore request that all records of the historians, other than those of the state of Qin, be burned. Anyone who uses antiquity to criticize the present shall be executed along with his family." End of quote. Thus, the Qin dynasty, following Li Si's recommendation, ostensibly rejected the past and concerned itself not with precedent, but with contemporary circumstances. And this is why Mao praised them. China should not remain entrenched in the past, in a stifling conservatism represented by Confucius, but should move boldly into a new era, following the revolutionary path blazed by Li Si and the first Qin emperor more than 2,000 years earlier. I hope that the irony has not escaped you. Mao wanted China to reject historical precedent, and he cited historical precedent for doing just that. Follow the past in getting rid of the past was essentially his argument. Even in this contradiction, though, Mao was following a precedent laid down by the Qin dynasty. Note that Li Si, in his memorial I just quoted, had said that the reason one should reject precedent is that that's what the 5 emperors in the past had done. The Qin should follow their precedent in not following precedent, just as Mao later would advocate following the precedent of the Qin in rejecting all precedents. The critical point for us today is that even in rejecting history, both Li Si in the 3rd century BCE and Mao in the 1970s remained thoroughly enmeshed in history. But if Mao needed to target a conservative for purposes of his own mass movement against Lin Biao, Confucius was probably a good choice, especially on the issue of history. One of Confucius's disciples, Zizhang, once asked him the following question: can 10 generations hence be known? The master Confucius responded, the Shang built upon the rites of the Xia. These are the dynasties. What was added and what was omitted can be known. The Zhou built upon the rites of the Shang. What was added and what was omitted can be known. Should there be a successor to the Zhou, even 100 generations hence, that successor can be known, end of quote. What Confucius is saying here is that if you study the course of history, if you notice what is omitted and what is made use of by a succession of dynasties or a succession of rulers, you can indeed predict the future. History in Confucius, then, becomes a guide to understanding the future. As such, of course, it cannot be ignored. And in China, despite the Li Sis and the Maos, history was not ignored. As we have seen, even Li Si and Mao, themselves self-proclaimed radicals, remained squarely caught in the contours of the past. They could not reject the past except by rummaging through the past in search of some historical precedent for that rejection. Item 2. In 1995, the government of China launched a large official project to research thoroughly and fix firmly the chronology of China's earliest 3 dynasties, the Xia, the Shang, and the Zhou. Now, as I have noted to you earlier, the earliest sure date that we have in Chinese history is 841 BCE. So the purpose of this project, launched by the government, was to fix as firmly as they could the chronology of China previous to that fixed date of 841. Many of China's finest archaeologists, historians, and hard scientists had their energy diverted into this project. It was given the highest priority, and even a few Western consultants, such as Professor David Nivison of Stanford, were flown to China as consultants. Why this flurry of activity? Here are some excerpts from an official Chinese report, and I quote, "Having a splendid cultural tradition, China is well known for her long history. The 3 dynasties were the crucial period when the Chinese civilization first flourished, and the ancient Chinese culture was formed and founded. Ancient world civilizations can be divided into 2 kinds, original and not original." I think that's a very category that historians would certainly dispute. Whether you can say that any civilization is entirely original, I think, is highly problematic. But at any rate, to go on with what they said, the former, that is, the original, have their own independent origin, are formed through the progress of their own development, have influenced others, but have not been influenced principally by others. The Chinese civilization belongs to the former. It influenced the Japanese civilization that was an important part of human civilization. Although it was characteristic and different from the Chinese, it could not have been formed without the influence and motive force from China. You see the politics involved in this statement. But when studying and researching this ancient Chinese civilization of 5,000 years, people find it difficult not having some chronological tables, as for Egypt or India, as a research basis. The earliest Chinese date acknowledged now, the report goes on to say, is 841 BCE. Hence, many scholars, domestic and foreign, have doubts on the ancient Chinese history, especially in modern times, wondering whether China truly has a 5,000-year history and whether the history can be acknowledged if it has no clear dates. It is a pity that China has not got this kind of authenticity. The tables of ancient Chinese history used are different or blurred, the report says, not satisfactory for research. So it is necessary to build a chronological system better and acknowledged in favor of ancient Chinese chronology with modern research means. It is the pillar of establishing China's 5,000-year history, without which nothing can be explained. End of quote. This is remarkable stuff. Now, far be it from me to criticize governments for launching huge projects of historical research, as long as I get to be part and I'm well paid. But this is a very curious project. And when you listen to the rhetoric of the statement that I just read to you, you see that there's something strange about it. First of all, you have this sense of national urgency. Something has gone terribly wrong. The great independent civilization of China is not being given the credit it deserves. It's not being put alongside Sumeria and Egypt as one of the oldest civilizations, and this is the fault of chronology. And if we can establish a solid chronology, then China will assume its rightful place among the great independent civilizations of the world. This situation, to quote the report again, is described as a pity and demeans a splendid cultural tradition. Now, I remind you that this intense concern about the past, indeed the deep, deep past, is taking place in that very same country where Mao, still not entirely repudiated, proclaimed his radical break with the past, his desire, like the first Qin emperor long before, to focus on current circumstances and not ancient circumstances. Other items could be added to the two items I have presented, but I think that my point is made. The ancient history of China has not gone away. In China, genuine teachers, to some extent, remain as Confucius defined them. His definition of a teacher: if one understands the new by warming up or by reviewing the old, one can be a teacher. That's from the Analects. So warming up the old, understanding the old, becoming familiar with the old, is a necessary platform from which to understand the present. My point then is that ancient China won't go away. But that doesn't answer the why in my title. Why won't it go away? Let me first make a general point about history, and this will be familiar, I think, to many of you. The 19th century was, in the West, a great period of nationalist historiography. Historians such as Michelet in France, Macaulay in England, and to some extent Bancroft in the United States, wrote history in a way that strengthened national consciousness. In so doing, many of these great historians committed what David Hackett Fisher has referred to as the fallacy of presentism. In Fisher's words, this fallacy, quote, is a complex anachronism in which the antecedent in a narrative series is falsified by being defined or interpreted in terms of the consequent. In other words, you take a current situation, a current institution, and then you falsify the past by projecting that institution, very often simply projecting it into the past. For example, when a nationalist history of France speaks of the Merovingian kings of France, or when a nationalist history of England says in the 11th century the Normans conquered England, we have to understand that we're using these terms France and England in those circumstances as kind of vague geographical locations. If we are implying that there was something like a national France for the Merovingians to lead, or there was a national state of England for the Normans to conquer, we're committing this fallacy of presentism. Nationalist history always tries to discover the roots of a national consciousness in the distant past, and in so doing attempts to promote national integration and national loyalties. Such history is in the service of the present, which history almost unavoidably so often is. What of China? Well, the whole notion of the nation state comes to China very late, and I'm not going to talk about the rise of something that we could call nationalism in China. There are folks here who could do a much better job of that than I can. But what I will argue in the next few minutes is that China, long before the rise of what we might call modern nationalism, had constructed itself as a grand unity, as a thoroughly integrated political entity, an entity that we might refer to as a civilization. To be more provocative, I would say, as an entity, constructed itself as an entity that might be called civilization itself. And this construction, I believe, was primarily the work of a great Chinese historian by the name of Sima Qian. He is sometimes rightly called the father of Chinese history. His vast historical project was undertaken in the wake of the formation of a Chinese empire, and was both the intellectual justification for empire and, in a peculiar way, that empire's textual equivalent. Sima Qian's historical work, like that of Michelet, Macaulay, or Bancroft so many centuries later, was very much shaped by presentism, that is, by the strong political needs of his own time. But before we turn to Sima Qian, we must ask ourselves what we really know of the earliest China that his history covers. He wrote a comprehensive history of China that discussed China from its beginnings with the Yellow Emperor down to his own time. So let's pause for a few moments and ask what historians, let's say critical historians, would say about this period of time. Writing first appears in China around 1300 BCE. It appears as oracle inscriptions carved on turtle shells and oxen bones. This is an example of an inscribed turtle shell. There is a mystery here, and that is that already this script that you see before you is a fully developed logographic script. All of the formative principles of Chinese writing are already present in this script. Historians of writing argue about how long it might have taken for a script of this type to evolve. And there are differences of opinion. Some of them, I think, driven as much by nationalism, national pride, or ethnic pride as by science. There are certain pottery shards from about 3,000, even as early as 4,000 BCE that have marks on them, and there have been attempts to relate those marks to this later script. I would suggest that such attempts are still conjectural, although we may one day discover that the antecedents of Chinese script go back that far, but that's still unproven. So we're still a bit in the dark on the early stages in the evolution of Chinese writing. Be that as it may, the oracle inscriptions preserve a record of a succession of priest kings who held sway in a core area near the Yellow River on the western edge of the northern China plain. I apologize for the fact that this slide's not terribly clear, but what it shows, I think, is a fairly realistic depiction of the area controlled by the Shang state in about 1200 to 1200, around 1200 BCE, shortly before that and shortly thereafter. David Keatley, the foremost Western historian of the Shang period, says, and I quote Keatley, "The area within which the late Shang king and his entourage could move with safety, and which through his allies and dependents he could make some claims to control, was not particularly large." I mean, if you look at this map, this is essentially the northern China plain around the Yellow River. It's far, far from filling out the geographical contours of China today. Moreover, the Shang state was probably only one of a number of cultural centers found in the large realm of today's China. Jessica Rawson notes, in speaking of early China, quote, "The Chinese landmass was occupied by many different competing people who created diverse states and cultures." In other words, Shang was probably one of many, perhaps the most powerful, but it was one of many, and it controlled a relatively small area. Sometime in the 11th century BCE, another people, the Zhou, conquered the Shang, establishing what would later be called the Zhou Dynasty. The Zhou center of power was further to the west than the Shang, with their capital being established in or very near modern-day Xi'an in the western part of China. Records from the early Zhou are more abundant and more varied than those from the Shang. These records, as well as abundant archaeological evidence, indicate that the Zhou projected power much more successfully than the Shang, but they were by no means able to erase the strong regional cultures that had flourished in the area of China, or later China, for several millennia. Furthermore, almost as soon as the Zhou state was established, sometime in the 11th or 12th century BCE, it began to weaken. And in 771 BCE, less than 300 years after its first appearance, it lost all real power. For the next 550 years, political power gravitated to the individual feudatories that had been established originally to serve the Zhou rulers. For much of this long period of disunity, at least if we can trust the account of the first Chinese narrative text, the Zhuozhuan, the major concern was not with how to re-establish some central unity, but how to maintain a multi-state system, a stable multi-state system. I mean, if you read the Zhuozhuan, you get very much the impression that many of the people of the time had resigned themselves to the fact that a multi-state system existed and were concerned about establishing some kind of a stable multi-state system rather than reestablishing some kind of a unified state. Here is, again, not very clear, but it shows you the extent of the Zhou world, larger than the Shang world, but again, by no means all of what we call China today, and divided after the fall of the Western Zhou in 771 BCE into these major states. Now, the Zhou continued to exist, it's right up here, but only as a very, very small state with only a kind of moral, not really a military power or authority. Eventually, one state, the state of Qin, conquered the other states, and in 221 BCE founded a new unified empire that reached far beyond the realm ruled by the Zhou more than 800 years earlier. Our word China derives from this dynasty, the Qin, and it was a very powerful unifying dynasty, but it too only lasted for 15 years, 14 or 15 years, before it fell to be succeeded by the Han. So what we have then in this story I have just presented you, and I hope not too tediously, but I've presented you, is a story of a growing sphere of what we might call probably falling into presentism as we do so, a growing sphere of Chinese culture. But what you have still is a great deal of disunity, cultural disunity. You have something that we might call the central state controlling a reasonably small area, and you have tremendous regionalism. In fact, you have a 550-year period of regionalism, and to me, the amazing thing is not that China fell into disunity in 771 BCE. The amazing thing is that it ever came back together again. Now, we might ask ourselves, to be fair, why did that happen? What kind of force brought China together again? Well, to be sure, we must acknowledge that a persistent concept of a unified China did exist prior to the Qin conquest of 221 BCE. The Zhou, however limited their power might have been, articulated the notion that they ruled by reason of possessing something that they called Chen Ming, heaven's mandate, and that mandate gave them the right to rule over what they called Tianxia, all under heaven. So there was this notion then, a political notion, of a mandate received from heaven that gave one the right to rule over all under heaven. Not only that, but there were certain poems, odes from the Shijing, an ancient work of poetry that existed throughout the Zhou dynasty that spoke of a grand period during the early Zhou where sage kings ruled with wisdom and power. What was really happening, I think, was that as China fell deeper and deeper into disunity, there was more and more of a tendency to project a golden age into the past. I mean, this happens in every civilization. So the Zhou, the early centuries of the Zhou, became this period of time onto which Chinese, living in a period of disunity and conflict, sort of projected their fondest political hopes. Moreover, during the last years of the Warring States period, I think it became clear to most political thinkers that the warfare that was going on between states was going to eventually lead to the victory of one state over all of the others. And that's, of course, what was going to happen. By the time of Mencius, the great philosopher Mencius, in the first part of the 3rd century BCE, for example, he was saying, who is it who will unify, who will make the state one? And so he was definitely looking for a political leader who could unify China. It's very interesting that when he was asked what kind of a person could unify China, he said someone who is benevolent, or someone we might say who is humane and who is righteous. It's so interesting that the unifier turned out to be someone that I think most of the philosophers of the time would have thought was the least righteous, but possessed of the most military power. In summary, then, historical evidence suggests that both the Shang state and the Zhou state were of limited extent, limited power, and that integration, insofar as it existed, was on a much more limited scale than the integration of the much later Qin and Han empires. However, these earlier polities, especially the Zhou, were seen as an antithesis to the disunity and conflict of the spring and autumn and warring states periods, and came to be regarded as a forerunner of what ought to exist, that is, a stable, unified polity. Now, I get to my final part of my argument today. Sima Qian, China's great historian, whom I referred to earlier, went far beyond the rather vague notions about early history that existed in his time. He created a new China. That's my argument. He created a new China. One is even tempted to say he created China. Let us turn then to his great historical project, the Shiji, which I'm going to call, after Bill Nienhauser's ongoing complete translation of the text, the records of the grand scribe, the Shiji. This 130-chapter work is the first comprehensive history to be written in the period, about the period we have been discussing here. It was a project initiated by Sima Qian's father, the too often forgotten Sima Tan, and was probably brought close to its final form sometime in the late 90s BCE, although it's very clear that there were later additions and interpolations. Now, the structure of the work is almost certainly that of his father, Sima Tan. And let me show you what that structure looks like. You have 130 chapters. You begin with 12 basic annals, and I'm going to say in a few minutes what those basic annals are, followed by 10 chronological charts, 8 essays, 30 hereditary household chapters, and then 70 memoirs, or what some people call biographies. I believe, for reasons there is no time to go into today, that the original design of the Shiji that Sima Tan laid out might have been for this unit to have 60 chapters, so that you would essentially have 2 large units to the text, a section of 4, a unit of 4 sections with 60 chapters, and then a second unit of 60 chapters. Why? Why do I believe this is the sort of conception that Sima Tan had, and that he was thinking in terms of 2 large units of 60? Sima Qian's father, Sima Tan, held an important position at court known as the Grand Astrologer. It was his duty, among other things, to maintain the calendar. Sima Qian followed Sima Tan in that position. He, too, was a Grand Astrologer. And Sima Qian, we know, was the leader of the great calendar reform that took place in 105 BCE that led to the calendar that was maintained in China virtually down to the present era. Now, there's no time here to go into the rather complicated details of the traditional Chinese calendar, but let me just say that what is important is that the calendar was based upon the numbers 12 and 10, and that the combination of a system of 10 written Chinese characters called the 10 celestial stems and 12 other characters called the 12 earthly branches generated, through their combination, a repetitive cycle of 60 days. The first 4 sections of Sima Qian's history, that is the basic annals, the charts, the essays, and the hereditary households, total 60 chapters. And there is reason to believe, as I've already indicated, that the second half, the memoirs, was to have included 60 chapters for a text totaling 120 chapters. Thus, the first 2 sections of the text, the basic annals and the charts, resemble the stem and branch characters in the calendric system. This 12 and 10. By the way, this is not my idea. This is the idea of a number of Chinese scholars, including the person I think is the best Sima Qian scholar in the world right now, Zhang Dake. But what you have here in these units of 12 and 10 is you have an imitation of the calendric system. And that these 2 sections are the basic sections of the text, which in a way generate the entire rest of the text. So what I want to do then is to focus just for a moment upon these 2 sections that I think are the key sections that generate the entire Shiji, the entire text of Sima Qian. The 12 basic annals section, section number 1, presents a continuous chronologically arranged history of Chinese rulers extending from the mythic Yellow Emperor, who would have ruled sometime in the middle of the 3rd millennium BCE, to the Xia Dynasty, the Shang, the Zhou, the Qin, and on into the Han. In Sima Qian's own words, and I quote, "Of the affairs that I have discussed and examined, I have made a general survey of the 3 dynasties and a record of the Qin and the Han, extending it back as far as the Yellow Emperor and coming down to the present, set forth in the 12 basic annals," end of quote. The core of the Chinese past, as one encounters it in Sima Qian, is a succession of kings and emperors, and their rule extends far into the past in an unbroken line. So he constructs China as a succession of kings leading directly from his own time through a succession of dynasties back to the Yellow Emperor. What is stressed in Sima Qian is continuity. We know that the Shang king's kingship of the Shang was quite different from the kingship of the Zhou. We know that there was a 550-year period of disunity. But what gets emphasized in this section of Sima Qian's text is continuity and sameness. The depiction of the ancient past found on the charts, the second section, Sima Qian's 10 chronological charts, is even more revealing. In his preface to the first chart, which is entitled The Generational Chart of the Three Dynasties, Sima Qian again admits that there are serious differences in the genealogical records of the earliest rulers, and that one cannot give exact years for their reigns. This is important, and it's always overlooked when scholars read the Shiji. In two places, Sima Qian says, we don't have dates for the earliest kings, we don't have dates for the Yellow Emperor, and all of the theories about the Yellow Emperor, all the stories I've been able to collect, are in conflict with one another. So he has serious doubts about the historicity of the Yellow Emperor. At the same time, on his chart, he constructs China as all of the rulers of China, down through the three dynasties as literal descendants of the Yellow Emperor. In other words, he not only creates a succession, but he creates a succession of a single family ruled periodically by different collateral lines, but all one big family. It is then Sima Qian's history that gives to Chinese the foundation for saying, as they do so often, 我们都是皇帝的子孙. We are all the sons and grandsons of the Yellow Emperor. This is how Sima Qian constructs the past. China is consists of a government of kings. It is continuous. It goes into the very most ancient times. It is a grand unity. Unity gets stressed over disunity. And it comes down to the time of Sima Qian. All of these leaders, however different they might seem to us, are part of one single family. Now, I can't help but point to one problem in Sima Qian's history, which a very interesting guy that I wish we had more time to talk about here, by the name of Chu Shaosun, who lived in the generation after Sima Qian, noticed. And it's this. In the account of the founders of the Shang and the Zhou dynastic lineages found in the basic annals, you have two grand ancestors, that is the grand ancestor of the Shang and the grand ancestor of the Zhou, who were born miraculously. And those stories of miraculous conception are passed on by Sima Qian from an older text, the classic of odes, the Shijing, where these stories can be found. The story of the founder of the Shang state goes something like this. There were three young women who went out to bathe. As they were bathing, one of them, Jian Di, saw a black bird, Xuan Niao, drop an egg, and she climbs out of the place where she's bathing, out of the lake, and she swallows this egg and becomes pregnant. And the child that she bears is the grand ancestor of the Shang state. The Zhou state is, the grand ancestor of the Zhou state is conceived when his mother goes out into the wilderness, I love this story, sees a footprint of a giant, steps upon the toe of that footprint, feels her body stir, and becomes pregnant. So those stories are passed on, thank goodness, beautifully, and in the basic annals as the origin of the Shang and the origin of the Zhou. However, if you go into the charts, what you find is that both the founder of the Shang line and the founder of the Zhou line, who in the basic annals are depicted as having this sort of miraculous origin, are simply put in a genealogical chart with their own fathers. So Chu Shaosun writes an essay sometime in the first part of the 2nd century BCE saying, what's going on here? Were they born with fathers or without fathers? And of course you can guess what his answer is. He says there is no such thing as a human being who is born without a father. So why does Sima Qian, this person he admires so much, tell the story the way he does in the basic annals? And he gives what I think is a good answer, that Sima Qian is trying to emphasize the kind of divine power, the right that the kings of these lines had to the mandate of heaven, and they had that right, they possessed that right because of their kind of semi-divine or at least miraculous ancestor in each of those two cases. But what Chu Shaosun does not criticize, I mean, he certainly picks up on this problem, but he says nothing about the arrangement of the charts, which is the arrangement that he favors, and the fact that the charts depict all of these early ancestors, be they the early rulers, be they the rulers of the Shang, the Zhou, or the Xia state, as being part of a single family. He does not criticize that, but he accepts that. So, why won't ancient China go away? My answer to that is it is because the father of Chinese history, the great Sima Qian, created a Chinese identity that was strongly anchored in a unified, integrated political structure deriving from the most ancient times. This creation of a new and very strong Chinese identity took place in the Han Dynasty, almost 120 years after the Qin had ended a very long period of disunity. And let me just say that the period of disunity actually continued into the early Han, as you historians know. And it was only during the reign of the Emperor Wu, whom Sima Qian served, that the last of the sort of rebellious states were finally squelched, and you really had a strong sense of a new glorious empire. And Sima Qian, I believe, wrote his history in the wake of that unification and in a way that provided a kind of intellectual basis, cultural basis for the empire that existed in his own time. Now, Chinese historians, of course, have questioned many aspects of Sima Qian's history. I don't want you to believe that the past that he presents goes unchallenged. It certainly does not. Just to give you an example, in the early part of this century, in the 1920s, there was a school of people called the Antiquity Doubters, the Yigu Pai, led by people like Gu Jiegang, who questioned much of the account of Sima Qian. But that was a time when China was still in the shadow of Western imperialism, and the fall of the dynastic system was racked, and in the wake of the fall of the dynastic system, and China was racked with self-doubt. We now live in a time when China is becoming strong once again, which I applaud. But it's a time when any doubt about the orthodox presentation of China's deep past is seen as robbing China of its glory, of its very claim to stand among the world's oldest independent civilizations. And that's the conclusion to which I've been working. Under the shadow of a long period of division, Sima Qian created a great history that stressed antiquity, continuity, and unity. His creation was fully equal to the glory of the emperor he served and has remained the orthodox history of ancient China down to the present time. Let me add, as something of a footnote, that ancient China, as it appears in the records of the Grand Scribe, is given even greater currency because of Sima Qian's own personal story. That story is indeed a compelling one of someone who suffered terribly and claimed that he was only sustained by his desire to complete a record of the past, a record his father had begun, and that he, Sima Qian, completed as an act of filial devotion. I will leave the painful details of that story for another time. But we'll only note here that it contains several themes that Chinese civilization came to cherish. First, and I love this, a devoted scholar born in the wrong time and therefore unappreciated. An indefatigable man of learning, completely committed to the preservation and transmission of the past. And a filial son, striving to fulfill the deathbed wish of a worthy father. These elements of one man's personal biography, the biography of Sima Qian, also help to give China a consciousness of its past that will never go away. Thank you. I apologize for perspiring so much, but that's in honor of how warm I usually am when I'm in Shanghai or something. I think we have time for questions if that's on the... Yes?
This is less of a historical question than a current political question. I'd like you to elaborate a bit on your speculation about what the current regime's motivations are for emphasizing early Chinese history.
Early Chinese history. I mean,
The three dynasties.
Yeah, what the motivation is?
Yeah, why they are putting so much effort into resuscitating and presumably...
Because I really believe that that's the essence of what China is. That is, China is, you know, we all of us have our ways of kind of constructing ourselves. This is not unique to China. And I think China has very much constructed its identity around this lofty antiquity and the notion of this great, that they are a civilization that has gone on for 5,000 years, a continuous civilization that stands alongside the other great ancient civilizations of the world, but unlike the other great ancient civilizations of the world, has continued down to the present time. So I think that there's a great deal of kind of ethnic national consciousness.
Let me try a slightly more poignant version of that.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm not a Chinese expert, so this is entirely speculation. The regime derived its legitimacy for about 50 years from the ideology of communism.
Yeah.
They have slowly been quietly renouncing it without admitting to it. They need to replace the wellspring of legitimacy that was once that ideology with something else. And so something else needs to describe it. Does that sound about right?
Well, I think so. I mean, you have certainly a period of time when there was sort of an attempt to reject this past that I've been describing. The whole Pekong Yangqin was an attempt to repudiate that past. But I would certainly yield to other people here who are specialists on modern China, David or Pete or whatever. David?
No, I actually have a question.
Oh, okay. Pete, do you want to say something, Pete?
Instead of comment, I have
Oh,
a
okay.
question. It's actually very simple, Given the wisdom of the Chinese history lesson that you've just given us,
Mm-hmm.
how can I make a buck out of it?
I missed the last part. I missed the good part.
How can we make a buck out of it?
How can we make a buck out of it?
Given the context of this lecture and the origin,
someone else had better answer that, because the only bucks I've made out of it so far have been attracting a few students. That sort of sustained me, and if I can manage to do it for 2 more years, I can retire happily. But if someone here knows how to make a buck out of this...
And the reason I'm asking this, obviously, is a comment on the very value that you placed on history itself.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And the concluding remarks you made about the sort of the 3 virtues that history itself has imparted in a historical sense. Right? And actually, the emphasis on history is the history, it contains within itself a kind of value that modern China doesn't have.
It doesn't value.
Doesn't have.
Are-
In other words, I'm thinking of the sort of overtaking of the value of money over the value of history.
Yeah, that's interesting.
So I'm just
Well, don't you think, I don't know, David,
that is to say, ancient China is going, regardless of all utopian fantasies.
Oh, darn it, I hope not. Don't you think that even among those who are very much engaged in the sort of the money-making pursuit, that at least rhetorical use of the past still carries some power? At least it hasn't. I'm not saying real serious understanding of the Chinese past, but a kind of rhetorical manipulation of the past.
Yeah, I think history has become a heritage industry through which you can sell commodities.
Yeah, I will not argue with that.
Actually, I'll go just to get a little more practical about that. If I am trying to sell some product or service to the Chinese market, some segment of that market has a deep reverence for the past, and that segment might find a historically themed message very resonant. 20-somethings with their cell phones might not, but 60-somethings.
Yeah, I
remember the old days.
My experience, limited as it is, and there are others with more experience in China than I have, is that people, at least people of my generation, still like to talk about history. When I say, when I say that, they say, well, what do you do? I say, well, I work on Sima Qian, or I work on Zhuozhuan. There's always this sort of, oh, wow, that's really great, and this sense that that's a wonderful thing to do. I've never had anybody say, why would you spend your life doing that? Now, they might say, for good reason, how can a Westerner possibly, study these things? One of my favorite stories about this was I gave a talk once in Taiwan, and after the talk, a very nice man came up to me and said, we Chinese have a difficult time taking you that seriously. And I said, is it because of my accent? Giving this talk in Chinese, my terrible Chinese accent. And what he said was wonderful. He said, no, everybody has an accent. But he said, when you write characters on the board, they're really ugly. and so that's why I don't write characters on the board. You see, my incompetence is being slightly shielded by the existence of word processing, thank goodness. Ina, did you have your... Were you saying... Yeah.
I just wanted to rescue Sima Qian. If you go to Beijing today and you get on a little touristy tour, you will find out that the Chinese government and the city government of Beijing has decided to establish a monument to history, which is called the Millennium Altar. And Sima Qian has a big place in this. And I will show you some pictures next week.
Well, but at least history is used as kitsch everywhere. We're certainly not above that here. Other questions? Yes?
If the Chinese government is now going to derive power from the cultural sense and kind of a perestroika of the USSR in the early 1990s, do you see that the Starbucks now in the Forbidden City, are they going to take more of an isolationist approach to Western culture and be more standoffish? Or do you think that they're going to continue to want to develop their economy, be more open?
I really need to yield to others on that point, but let me kind of reiterate what my argument is. My argument is not, it's a different argument that I will leave to others to either make or reject. It's not so much that the modern leaders of China in some sort of conscious way derive their authority from reference to these ancient rulers of the past. That's not really my argument. What my argument is that Sima Qian constructs a Chinese identity around ancient Chinese history, and to some extent that identity has not been escaped up until the present time, that the very idea of what it means to be Chinese has something to do with the sense of an identity with this ancient history laid down by Sima Qian. So I'm not really making an argument about the particular way contemporary leaders derive their authority. I will leave that up to Pete and others in the room to consider. But what I'm talking about is a kind of something like a national consciousness, although this is before the age of nationalism. I grew up with U.S. nationalist history. I grew up with all these stories of, George Washington chopping down cherry trees and Abraham Lincoln walking all this distance to return a penny. I don't know what it was. And a history that was meant to give me a sense of pride in being an American. And I constructed some kind of constructed my self-consciousness to some extent around that. And I think that the Chinese did that too at a somewhat earlier period of time around this great history of Sima Qian. So that's my argument. Pete?
Well, it raises an interesting question, and that is the burden of this history as well. In some ways, it goes to his question and the problems of, in fact, achieving all these objectives of modernization and so forth, when in fact you have this burden, which of course is not a new story. But could you address the extent to which this history is as much a burden as it is a source of identity?
Well, I think that it let's just take a simple notion, and I'll let David and Zhenjun and Gao Chen and others who are in the room say whether this really has any echoes today or not. Let's take this notion of Chen Ming, which was very important in Chinese history, the idea that you rule by reason of possessing heaven's mandate. Now, that's been constructed, explained somewhat differently by different philosophers, but if you take the mention view, which was often understood, heaven sees as the people see. Therefore, if you behave unrighteously as a ruler, it kind of sanctions an act of rebellion from the people. And that simply means that heaven's mandate is changing. Moreover, the way that dynastic change is often signaled, at least the way it's been written up in the traditional histories, is that you have a series of disasters that occur, earthquakes, floods, and so forth. This often signals that the people are discontent and that heaven's mandate is being withdrawn. I honestly believe that some of these ideas still exist, and that when things like the Tianjin earthquake occur, rulers get real nervous. So I think that there is a burden that this history brings. And I think you could probably think of other ways in which it still kind of echoes in the background and in some ways shapes decisions. I mean, this whole notion that the ruler of the people is Wei Min Fumu, is a parent to the people. I mean, that establishes a kind of patriarchal authority that I don't think we identify usually with our presidents. I mean, I don't think that we think of whoever the president might be as being Wei Min Fumu, a parent to the people. That's not a part of our sort of political world. And I think that these ideas, sure, I think they continue to echo in some ways. But I would call upon you, Gun, also sitting there, and others who might have something to say about this. There's a lot of China knowledge in this group, so don't hesitate to jump in and bail me out if you would like to. I would say this, despite what David said, and I think David's point is an interesting one. It's good if you're going to China. Well, it's good if you're going anywhere, but it's particularly good if you're going to China to do a little reading of Chinese history. I mean, it is a country with a fascinating and important history, and whatever you're going there for, it's good to know something about that past. For a reading list, see Ina Asim.